Yeah, so as Paul says, the unenviable task of the final session of the day. So I do have to summarize everything, but I also have to do it on time so everyone can go and have a drink. So I will be clock watching. And thanks, Paul. Can anyone spot the special use of a word on this first title slide? I'll give you a clue, it's in the first line. How many times have people said fair today? So I wanted to say candid because it's a different version of fair. But yeah, there we go. Is the clicker going to work? Right, firstly, I have an admission. Okay, I'm a thief today. I'm not really talking about anything that's my own. I'm talking about everything that everybody's already shared today. I'm not that kind of thief or that one. I'm hopefully a productive thief. I do have some current experience about summarizing and trying to coordinate and bring everything together. So a little bit of a shameless update. For those people at Zifo who know and are probably really bored of it, I'm doing a house renovation at the moment, and this is my roof as of 2 days ago. So you can imagine the level of coordination, understanding, listening, and this isn't with scientists, this is with builders and plasterers and plumbers and electricians. Now I could say that they're much harder to work with than scientists, or I could say that actually these guys are super easy to work with. Do you know what? It doesn't matter. This is a people scenario, and we'll come to people shortly. What have we talked about today? As Paul said, we covered our threads, our different topics. We've talked about organization. We've talked about process. We've talked about data, and we've talked about technology. And interestingly, the poll that was just run actually showed a relatively even split across all of these. But one did come out on top, and I'm quietly pleased because there's some interesting observations on that. Again, as has been mentioned a few times today, and none of this is coordinated, so we're actually all quite aligned, which is nice, is when we kind of look at these 4 areas, the data and the technology pieces are the ones that we tend to gravitate towards. It's been said, first thing, re-referenced by Paul, technology is usually the one that we go to first because it's kind of the easiest. Now it's not, we're all technologists, and implementing a new platform is really hard, but it's easy compared to marshalling 50, 100, 1,000, 3,000 people. So we're talking about very, very different areas that we like to focus on, and we do tend to focus on these bottom 2. And I think there's one reason that we tend to do this. So just a quick show of hands, who in the room is originally a scientist or from a scientific background? Okay, so I would say the majority are. Now, my family quite often asks me, what do you do? And I can't really ever tell them. And then they ask a few more pointed questions, but they say things like, why is it so hard to do things within your industry? And I think it's because a lot of us are scientists. And throughout our entire upbringing and background as a scientist, we're taught to do things in a certain way. We have to plan. We have to write things down. We have to think about things logically. We have to come to conclusions. We have to prove. And then we have to prove again, and we have to take bias out. So these 2 things of technology and data tend to be more logical. They play to our strengths and what we know and understand. We're not necessarily too familiar with people. And again, my family will ask me, why did you leave the lab? Well, I left the lab, and I'll guarantee a few other people here will say this as well. I left the lab because I wanted to interact with people. In the lab, it is quite solitary, but not all people want to do that. You know, interacting with people, especially with lots of different people in lots of different scenarios, is tough. The one that's kind of the slight outlier here is process. As scientists, we should love process. Nice and logical, we can follow process. But again, how many people here have attempted to harmonize process across their organization? Quick show of hands. How many have achieved true harmonization? Yeah, what I thought. Look, we all make inroads on this and we improve, but again, it's very, very difficult. It's not as easy as generating a URS, confirming and validating that URS, and then delivering functionality in a particular product set. So that's why we tend to gravitate to those particular areas. So let's look at the technology conundrum or question first. And again, Paul showed a bigger version of this with many more products on. But here's just some that have kind of popped up. And we've got ELNs, LIMS, SDMS, CDS. These are all fairly familiar, but then starting to appear more and more. There's other things. You know, there's knowledge graphs. They've been referenced many times today. You know, there's Gen AI. But we've also got things like Python, which I hear every single time I talk to someone. Do you know Python? Do you have Python skill sets? We need Python. We need Python configuration. So what's happening is the technology landscape is growing and growing and growing all the time. And it's not going to shrink. Okay, we've talked about single platforms and implementing single platforms to cover all eventualities within an organization. I think that's actually completely the opposite. If we look at this in 2 or 3 years' time at SiEE, where you'll all be, I would say, in fact, we'll take that as an action. We'll show what the difference is and see how this looks different. But I would guess that it's going to be much bigger because even 2 or 3 years ago, this was smaller. Gen AI wouldn't have been on there 2 or 3 years ago. People would have known about it, but it wouldn't have been there. So, you know, we'll take that technology decision, and thankfully a few people talked about this very topic today, which again is great, not planned, but you know, it shook out that way. So someone makes the technology decision, we need to implement a new or a replacement ELN, and quite often, and it was referenced again in an earlier talk, to facilitate our digital transformation. That's what is believed to be digital transformation. Now it can be in certain organizations, but I would suggest that it is a piece in the puzzle towards digital transformation. It would not deliver you the whole thing. And as we heard again, right at the beginning of the day, the lines are becoming blurred. Yeah, ELN, LIMS, platforms, data management, they're all starting to blend. And that introduces 2 problems. So one is we are seeing technologies emerging and they're not actually a LIMS or an ELN. They're something else. But what happens when they start to talk with our customers or with Zifo or with other people, they say, well, what are you? Are you an ELN? Are you a LIMS? And they go, no, we're not really. Well, what are you then? And it's very difficult to actually put them into a category because we're conditioned to start thinking about these names and these terms and these silos. Okay, so it's only one piece of the overall picture. But we understand it, so that's the one that we're going to focus on. We know as well with technology, data is something that becomes interesting and important and containable in terms of our understanding. But again, it's not just one type of data. Again, a very, very small subset. You know, there's been mention in the very first talk by Chris around allotrope, for example. There's other standards. There's standards in other areas, in health, in clinical. But there's other pieces that wrap around data, things like data modeling, again, which has been covered many, many times. So we need to consider all of these aspects when we think about data, not just ones and zeros, or just my omics data, or just my NGS data. It's everything. So actually, when we boil it down, data is a hugely complex problem. And in fact, every single person who's referenced data today has underlined that point. Otherwise, everyone would have been able to say, when every question got asked of what was your ROI on that particular data project, they would have been able to immediately say it was 15.4 million. But no one could, okay? Because we don't yet know what the value of our data is, because no one's really solved this entire problem yet. So, in a similar vein to I want to implement an ELN, we pick one thing, fair data. We want to fairify our organization. We want it to become a methodology, an approach, a concept throughout our organization, and then that will allow all of our data to become super valuable. Is that true? Maybe, but I wouldn't say for every single case. And in fact, again, Max referenced the comment, love the comment, fair enough. It's great because lots of people will invest millions, and I guess across the industry, hundreds of millions to verify their data. Are we going to get hundreds of millions back by doing every single aspect of data verification? Probably not, but certain elements of it, categorically yes. And in fact, the presentation where it was focusing on those two key aspects within the F, I would agree with that approach as well around, how we view and look at data. And then we come from data to the kind of process. We've got a very, very vast landscape of stuff in our organizations and labs. Okay, these are just some pieces of equipment, but we've got many, many systems as well. Commercial off-the-shelf systems, we've got in-house built systems, we've got structured data, unstructured data, and we've got instrumentation. The point was made earlier today around excellent machinery that produces vast amounts of data, but if you can't do anything with that, you lose a whole host of benefits. So, take the Amber 250. It's, what are they, 10 years old, 12 years old now, the Amber 250, developed by Merck in conjunction with TAP Biosystems, now at Sartorius. I know because we used to have an Amber at my last company, but this machine produces colossal amounts of data during a 2, 3, 4 week run. Vast amounts of information. So it runs through loads and loads of sampling of activities, and it's high throughput. It gives you loads of information. So everyone bought an Amber 250, and then they realized that even though the work in the lab was going really, really quickly, the analysis then became the bottleneck. So you would hear my 2-week fermentation run is taking 4 weeks for me to collate the data. So we've pushed the problem from one place to another. Okay, and that's just talking about that one instrument. In order to get the whole picture, we have to connect the whole lot. And again, as we've heard today, there's no standard for data formats. So every instrument produces its own format. And reading it in is relatively transactional. It's technology, it's easy. Stitching it together and actually understanding how it's related is not so easy. Okay, so we do end up with this spaghetti. But what would everyone like to be able to do? They just want to have a picture of it in their ELN or their LIMS or their dashboard. That's what they'd like to be able to do. So this data problem in the middle that Max talked about, for example, with the data automation is a very, very real problem. Okay, but it's only part of the process challenge. That's the data problem. And really what we see is we see many, many different solutions or scenarios to try to address this, but they always look at retrospective data problem addressing. So what I mean by that is, this is when the wet work has been done. Okay, it's always you're writing up your experiment. You're always collecting your data afterwards. What we should really be doing as a group is we should be enabling the people who are running the process to actually execute their wet work with technology and collect and document their work at exactly the same time. It should be a seamless process. It shouldn't be disconnected. And all too often, it is disconnected. So we're trying to solve a retrospective problem. So even when we do something like removing all of these different manual touch points to move from a middleware to a sample inventory, or from a liquid handler into the middleware, or from the liquid handler into the ELN, all we're doing is we're streamlining the documentation process. We're not necessarily streamlining the execution process, which is their full end-to-end wet work. And that should be the ambition. Okay, it should be physical automation, data automation, aligned with the processes that are being executed in the lab, so that you actually get a scientist coming in, using a tool, saying what they're going to do, hitting a button, the experiment runs and documents itself. And we have pieces of that, but we don't have it across all of our different functions and modalities, which are only getting more complex, as Paul mentioned this morning. So if we, I don't know why that slide repeated itself. I pressed the wrong button. I pressed the up instead of the down to progress. But then we move on to the organisation itself. And I'm very pleased that in the survey, and thank you, the Gen Z reference came up. Or is it Gen Z? It does. But again, I had a kind of image of this many years ago in terms of just roles and responsibilities within a standard informatics project in our space. And it was a BA, a biologist, a chemist. You know, you'd have a project manager, you might have a program manager, you'd have a developer or two, and that's kind of where it stopped. Maybe there's some SMEs that come in and out, but again, 5, 6, 7 years ago, you certainly wouldn't have a cloud engineer in there. You wouldn't have a data architect. You know, you wouldn't have a data scientist. But now, on purpose, these are growing in size because they're becoming more and more important. The talk just before or just after lunch around the size of the data scientist problem, you know, and the request of what was the value of that. Well, our data scientists spend too much time finding things, and then they don't even know if what they've found is right to be able to work on. Okay, so that's not a great use of somebody's time from a people perspective. So we have to make sure that if we're going to successfully execute across technology, data, and process, we've got the right people. And the image that you had, thank you very much, where you had your different components around the taking people from different parts of the organization, borrowing, et cetera, actually having the right people in place to actually be able to deliver the right team of people is crucial. You know, who in their organization or within their own teams has all of these functions accessible to them just tomorrow? Very few, I would wager. So we need to look to see how we can actually resource these people. And the reason I wanted to reference Generation Z is, as Paul says, we've known each other for a long time, so I am actually quite old, and I do have an adult son who, for his sins, has decided to go into science as well. And I was talking to him last year, and he was doing a research project at university, and he was telling me about having to go out and select a cohort to be able to interview and ask them questions. And then he said, "Oh, Dad, I had to collect all this information. I had to type it into Excel, and then I had to do some formulas and do some charting." I said, "What are you using Excel for?" And he said, "My lecturer, my head of the department, told me that's what I had to do because that's what they do in industry." So what's happening is, regardless of what we decide to do as an organization in terms of upskilling our workforce, And I think the what was the phrase? The data stewards, the the drive to allow people to become data literate within organizations is fantastic. This is a must, and it's excellent that people are doing that within their own organizations. But actually there's a problem that's before that. Is if we're generating a workforce from our academic institutions that think Excel is the tool that scientists use within industry, I would argue we've got a bigger problem to solve, that really we should actually be looking to see how we could address that at the academic level. So that was quite an eye-opener for me. I did then try to sell him an ELN, but that didn't go down too well because the university that he's at doesn't have any money. And I just wanted to kind of close out on a short story, which hopefully starts to bring some of this together. But there's been a few comments today and a few questions around value. Why did you do something? What was the rationale behind doing it? Did you generate a business case? Did it stack up? And a few years ago, I worked in one of my previous organizations with a company, a top 10 pharmaceutical company in the UK. And it was within the discovery biology group, so specifically assay development. And this group wanted to be able to do better. So they did the usual thing, is they looked at some tech. They went out to market to have a look at some tech, to do stuff better in assay development. And they looked at some tooling that looked really cool and funky and new and, didn't have AI, but it was interesting. And they created a business case that was based around our scientists will get half a day back per week or 1 day back per week. And that was proven in terms of their business case. And they presented it to the SVP of discovery biology. And he said, I don't care about any of that. He said, I've seen 50 business cases where someone said it improves efficiency, it reduces mistakes, it takes transcription away. He says, I don't care. I'm not going to approve another business case that says that. So we said, so how can we get the business case approved? And he said, and this was his exact words, I want you to demonstrate better science. And he left it there. So how do you prove better science? How do you give an ROI or an actual outcome that shows you've done better science? Now, this was in assay development, so thankfully it was an area that I was relatively familiar with, and so were a number of the team. And the customer was awesome. They were super engaged. The SMEs wanted to work with us. They wanted to make this work. So what we did is we said, well, how can we prove something is better? And one of the guys based in Cambridge came up with the fact that in assay development, they try to develop assays, and lots of them don't work. So they throw them away. So they said, well, why don't we find some of the ones that didn't work and push them through the new way of doing it and see if they work? And if they work, we've got an outcome. And even if they don't work, we can say, well, we've proven that they weren't very good. So we selected 6 discrete assays, both non-cellular and cellular-based assays, and all 6 that were on the shelf that had been deemed as untenable, not cost-effective, or just didn't work. All 6 of them came back into the pipeline. So you think how many potential therapies are on the shelf because someone said, that's not viable, it's too expensive, we can't make it work. Imagine if you could run them through something else. You did something in a different way. You looked at it differently, and you went, do you know what? We've just found our next blockbuster, or we've just found the next thing that, saves 10,000 kids' lives a year. How cool is that? So we were able to, just within a POC, reinvigorate 100% of the assays that they thought were non-viable. Now I know better science, okay, it's a little bit subjective, but the SVP then went, yep, okay, you're good, let's progress. And now let's do everything that we've put on the shelf that we can put through this process and see what we can find. Now, I don't know the current state, But around 7-8 months later, all of those assays were still being processed through the pipeline and had gone into lead discovery, which is awesome. So it's just a way of thinking. When we start to bring all of these things together and we look at it from an outcome-based perspective, as opposed to just meeting requirements and delivering new functionality, we can do something very, very cool. So I've just talked about this and obviously didn't follow my slides, but you know, this is what we wanted to be able to achieve. And I think all of the aspects that we've talked about today, okay, they all come into this. But I would say that the most important one, and again, given the poll, is assemble the right team and promote the desired state and outcome. If everyone understands where they're getting to, you're more likely to get there. So ensure that you have your buy-in from your organization, your team, your SMEs, your partners, your vendors. And work really, really hard. We did have to work really, really hard, but if you work really hard with those components, then you have a much higher likelihood of success. We had the question around, did you get your desired outcome? Was it successful? Did you get an ROI? Thankfully, in this case, the SVP actually told us what the outcome should be. So we knew what our outcome needed to be. But if we hadn't baselined that, it would be very, very difficult to say if we'd actually achieved what we needed to. And I think there's been a few questions and answers today around, have you achieved what you wanted to? How did you measure it? And a few of the answers have been, that's a really good point. We need to make sure we do that. Please, please, please do it, because it allows you to continue and do more because you're achieving what you said you were going to or trying to get there. So, bringing it all together. Now, this is a shameless slide about teaching old dogs new tricks. So, I wanted to bring the picture of the 4 components together in a really geeky, animated way in a slide deck. So I Googled how to make a jigsaw puzzle in PowerPoint, and I followed a YouTube video to make it. And I'm really, really proud because I've never done that before. So if anyone wants to steal an animated jigsaw slide, you're welcome to steal my PowerPoint template. But yes, if we bring all 4 together, we do come together with a nice, complete picture. So theme of the day, that's what we've brought all together. Thank you all for your contribution. And if anyone has any questions or comments, happy to take them.
Bravo, man.